as I said, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Alexandra. I work in NABERS Waste in the NABERS team, and we sit in the market development team at NABERS. Thank you for joining us for this, which is actually our last waste event for the year. This is an industry webinar that we're hosting today, and we'll be discussing the role that buildings play in Australia's transition to a circular economy. Before we start to get into the nitty-gritty, into housekeeping, into who you're going to be hearing from today and what you're going to be hearing, I'd like to, of course, start by acknowledging that I am joining you today from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is a very warm and sticky day here on Gadigal land where I am in Alexandria. And I would like to acknowledge that we are all meeting on Aboriginal lands across the nation today. And I would like to pay our respects to the traditional custodians on the lands on which we meet and acknowledge any Aboriginal people who are joining us today. So a few bits of housekeeping. Your mic has been muted. I'm sure we've all done this many, many times before and we know the drill, but still handy to cover the basics before we get started. So your mic has been muted if you are a participant, and we don't have the chat open today for everyone. We will be sending you a few bits of information as you need them throughout the webinar, but the chat isn't an open chat today. However, you can post any questions you have at any time through the Q&A feature, and we can either answer those. We've got a few tech elves hiding in the background from the NABERS team who might be able to answer them straight away in writing, or we can answer them during the live Q&A. And please do use the upvote option. So you can actually upvote questions if someone's already asked a question that you think is great and you really want to hear an answer to it. Please do let us know and we will do our best to answer them essentially in order of how they've been asked and how they've been upvoted. So the agenda for today, we will start with a welcome and a general sort of high-level NABERS update from Ron Polito, who is our acting head of market transformation here at NABERS. For those of you, you may have noticed that there was actually someone else due to give that update if you had seen the registration page or the email, but unfortunately the tech gods have not smiled in her favor today and she has passed it over to Ron. Thank you so much, Ron, for jumping in this morning. We will then be hearing from Andrew Bushell, who is our acting head of product here at NABERS, and he will be talking about the future of waste management and resource recovery in the Australian built environment. And then lastly, we will be having a nice, robust panel discussion with Josh Begbie from GECA, David Baggs from Global GreenTag, and Alex Northey from WasteCheck. Especially Alex Northey, he is a waste assessor, so a few of you might have already met him or know of him already. And we will be having that panel at the end. There will be a combined Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions for any of the speakers or panelists, we'll be doing that all in one Q&A right at the end, just to keep things moving along. So I'd like to start by passing over to Ron. Ron, I will turn off my camera if you can turn yours on. You are good to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And so I'm excited for you all and thank you all for joining today. I do apologize in advance that you do need to deal with my ugly face instead of Magley's, but hopefully you can still get a lot from my update. So of course, here at NABERS, we're very keen to make sure that you got a fit for purpose waste tool, that it's ultimately useful, very easy to use and understand, but we're also very keen to share a lot of information that you hear today, also share knowledge and in general improve waste and resource recovery outcomes. So I'll give you a high-level update on the annual report, but also our strategic plan. Moving to the next slide. So we've just released our annual report for the last financial year. Sorry, just drop it back one slide. So we've just released our annual report for the last financial year, which has a wealth of information about NABERS and the buildings we rate. So this year is the first year that we've had a full year of the renewable energy indicator data, for example, and it's been really, really interesting to be able to dive into the trends and look at the different sectors. So I thought, for the purposes of this webinar, I'd highlight the waste dashboard, and we'll drop a link for you in the chat as well so that you can also look through that. So on this slide with the KPIs and sector performance, we've been doing waste ratings since 2019, and it's been great to see the waste ratings take off, especially as circular economy and waste has become more and more important. This year has also seen hotels and shopping centers participate through our waste verification tool. But there's also a clear upward trend in the number of buildings that are achieving a waste rating of 5 stars or higher. And this is actually similar to a trend that we're seeing in other rating types, where the act of measuring the performance helps to manage and improve that performance. So with the next slide, we'll see something interesting as well. So it's interesting to note that with the average star rating, we can actually see that the recycling rate has a slight decline over the first 2 years after the launch. But as buildings better understand their data and learn to track their performance, we've actually seen that steadily increase in the average star rating. So, this brings us to the question, and really the question is, what can we do to drive better waste and recovery outcomes in the future? And in the next slide, I'll touch on our strategic goal and also the goals that we have there. So we launched this at our conference earlier this year in June, and it's a 5-year strategic plan, so will run until 2029 and is based on 3 main goals that you can see. So the first goal with being improved performance, second one, grow the market, and the third one, evolve for impact. So moving to the next part that will give you all a bit of information on each of these sectors. One important thing to know is that, these goals are important because they help us as an organization prioritize and make strategic decisions about the program. So with improved performance, this goal is about meeting NABERS' ultimate goal, and that's to help improve the environmental performance of buildings. It's actually something that has been implicit for our program for quite some time, and this is actually the first time we've made it into an explicit goal. The second one on grow the market, this goal builds on the previous strategic plan and continues the focus on increasing participation in NABERS across all jurisdictions, building types, and rating types. And for that third one, you can see there on evolve for impact. While our other goals look at the growth and improvement, this goal actually looks at ways that NABERS can evolve for more impact. So it recognizes that the sustainability area is very dynamic, and that NABERS will need to evolve to stay relevant. For instance, when we developed our last 5-year strategic plan, the embodied carbon area was actually quite a niche area. But however, we found that it's moved very rapidly over the course of just those 5 years, and we're actually now about to release a national standard for embodied carbon. So this goal gives us the flexibility to respond to those up and coming opportunities. And on the next and final slide, I told you about those goals, but what does it mean for you? What does it mean for the waste sector in general? So with the first one, we want every building sector to improve. We're focusing on capturing and sharing best practice with case studies and events like the webinar today. The second one with grow the market, and just moving through the slides, you get a bit of a piece of information on each of them. So I did mention earlier, we're actually seeing a lot of organic growth in NABERS waste ratings. So we'll continue to support this through outreach, particularly to sectors that can now use our waste verification, such as data centers, aged care, and schools. And with the last one, we developed that 5-year strategic plan. So we've also developed a 5-year waste plan, and that'll help us respond to emerging requirements and opportunities in the waste, resource recovery, and circular economy spaces. So we do plan to review that regularly, given that it is such a dynamic area. So I'll pass it over to Andy now, who's going to dive into some lessons and future outlooks of waste. Thank you all so much.
Thanks for the intro, Ron. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the current acting head of product development at NABERS. However, I'm also the sector lead responsible for engagement and outreach for our waste tools. And I'm here today to talk about the waste learnings from the last 10 years, the current and future trends, and how NABERS waste fits into broader strategies around waste, circular economy, and achieving net zero. Now, this presentation is an adapted version of the one that was originally given at the AWRE Summit in July. And before I get into it, I just wanted to point out that the focus of this talk is on operational waste for the commercial sector. So I wanted to start off by looking at the past and, what's the trends and events and challenges of the last 10 years that have shaped and continue to shape waste and circular economy in Australia today. And if you jump to the next slide, I'll jump off to the next one. So to kick off, I wanted to look at the big shifts in the way waste management is being practiced by building owners. There's two key elements here. Number one, there's improved procurement, where we're starting to see more and more examples of sustainability metrics being included in waste contracts. And the second one is better data collection and management processes by building owners themselves. And this allows for greater trust in the actual waste data that's been outputted. From these two elements, we're seeing significant improvements in the accuracy of waste insights and reporting using these robust data sets. So overall, we're getting a clearer picture of where the industry's at. But the not so great news is that looking at it, it's not ideal at the moment. You can see here a screenshot from the 2022 National Waste Report, and that shows that waste generation has been increasing each year while resource recovery rate is improving. There are still challenges around what is actually considered recovered. So overall, the summary is that we're starting to see better reporting, which is great, but we're not necessarily seeing improvements in the way the waste is handling. And if you jump to the next slide, we'll look at some of the stuff that's been happening in recent years that shaped waste and resource recovery sector over the last couple of years. Some pretty significant global influences. First up, we've got the China sword policy, which has occurred in 2018. And that was basically halting of recycling material export. That resulted in the halting of recycled material export industry pretty much overnight. And following China's lead, further waste export bans were enacted by other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, resulting in major disruption to the industry here in Australia. Next, we've got the COVID-19 pandemic, which saw further disruptions in waste management and recycling operations due to staff shortages, new safety protocols, and increases in both volume and contamination rates of waste streams, particularly from the residential sector. And the last big global influence here is the European Union's action plan for circular economy that set really ambitious recycling targets and policies that have set a benchmark for other countries, including Australia, to improve recycling rates and reduce waste. So overall, these influences have revealed some pretty large weaknesses in Australia's domestic capacity to recover materials and the lack of regulation to push innovation domestically, which means today it's quite hard for Australia to be circular. In the next slide, just want to kind of point out, though, that it's not all doom and gloom. In recent years, we're seeing government really stepping up in implementing policies to move towards a more circular model. This infographic that you can see summarizes current waste targets set by government policy at all levels. And what's notable is the alignment of targets across federal, state and territory governments. So we've got targets to recover 80% of all waste by 2030, halve the amount of organic waste set to landfill by 2030 as well as resource recovery strategies, action plans, and roadmaps. And what's also really good to see is a growing number of LGAs are setting up higher targets with more ambitious timelines for their jurisdictions. So a good example of this is the City of Sydney, which is currently targeting 90% recovery by 2030. Moving on to the built environment. We're seeing a lot more dialogue around waste, resource recovery, and circular economy over the last 5 years. Here's a list on the left there of various expos and conferences that are looking at this topic from various angles. And it's not just specific to the waste and resource recovery industry. So we're also seeing increasing discussion in larger sustainability forums, such as GBCA's Transform Conference. And at the biennial NABERS CBD conference that happened earlier this year, the circular economy session saw over 120 people attend the panel session in person, which was the largest of all the session streams. That session was recorded, so if you missed out, you can jump onto the NABERS YouTube channel and check it out. Further to this, we're also starting to see more industry bodies advocating for change. A good example of this is the Better Building Partnership, which has the organisations that you can see there on the right working collaboratively to assist members on better management of operational waste. And lastly, we're seeing waste becoming more visible, and companies are setting more and more ambitious targets in a very public way. I know it's a little bit small to see here, but there's a couple of examples of reporting and target setting taken from the reports of a handful of the largest property portfolio owners in the office industry. What's notable is that these aren't just buried in some ESG report or an appendice somewhere. They're actually located in very prominent locations within their annual report. So this is really becoming a big focus for companies to publicly make these commitments and show where they're at. So now, I just wanted to take a very brief look at how NABERS Waste fit into broader strategies around waste, circular economy, and achieving net zero. So on the next slide, I just want to give a very quick background, a brief history of the NABERS program. We've been operating for over 25 years, making it one of the longest running sustainability programs in Australia. And originally, it was about energy ratings for offices. And as you can see there, above the timeline, we've been progressively expanding the energy side of things. But NABERS Waste, on the other hand, only really started in 2018 with the release of the office rating tool. And while we did expand to hospital in public hospitals in 2023, it's still lagging a little bit behind. But this doesn't mean that we only have tools for offices and public hospitals. We released waste verification in 2022. So basically, that allows any building type to have third-party verification of waste data that just don't get a star rating. And that's simply because we don't have the data to build the benchmarks to allow that fair comparison. So while there's a big gap between first release of energy in 1999 and the first waste tools, there is the momentum to push and catch up. Just wanted to take a very quick light touch on how exactly energy and waste ratings are different. So there's definitely similarities, and the reason why I'm doing this comparison is because traditionally NABERS is associated with energy ratings, and for the most part, a lot of what our waste ratings do is very similar. So firstly, both require third-party NABERS assessors to work on the rating. They both require 12 months of actual data as the basis for the application. Both require verification of data by site visits. So, whereas energy, the assessors go and check supply points and the end users. For waste, it's about undertaking contamination audits and bin counts. Ultimately, we're determining an intensity metric, and that all basically gets pulled together for a rating application that is audited by NABERS, and a result which is a star rating out of 6 stars. So that's exactly the same between energy and waste. However, there's some key differences in waste. Firstly, you've got actually 2 energy matrix. So I've highlighted there on the right there, not only is there a waste intensity of how much waste per kilogram per meter squared per annum, there's also the recycling rate. So these 2 metrics are what feed into determining the star rating. If you jump on the next screen, you'll see the material recovery score, which provides a percentage breakdown of what happens to waste material once it leaves the premises. So this score is broken down into the 5 categories, and you can see that there, and also the definitions. So you've got from the top to bottom: circular recycling, downcycling, linear recycling, unverified recovery, and if it's not recycled in any way, disposal, so anything going to landfill. And determining the score requires applicants to provide increasingly robust paper trails as you go up that classification. So if you can't meet, sorry, I can jump back to the previous one. If you can't meet, say, the requirements of circular recycling, it inevitably goes down to unverified recovery. I should note that these categories and definitions were picked to closely align with the GRI standard for waste reporting, and that was done in order to streamline ESG reporting for all NABERS customers. If you jump to the next slide now, the third thing I wanted to highlight was the data quality score, and this is something that's unique to waste. So this is basically, our waste results are modified by this metric, which assesses the reliability and accuracy of the data that is inputted. So the score looks at the three major areas there: how weights are calculated, the contamination rates and how they're determined, and the verification by cross-checking data against secondary sources. And this approach is done to overcome data quality issues that we commonly see across the waste industry, and aims to overall increase the quality of waste data by fostering improved processes by building owners. So, the simple thing here is that, you can have the best recovery rates, but if the data that's used to determine that is questionable, then you're not going to end up with a 6-star or a 5-star. It'll actually diminish. So on the next slide, how exactly does this all fit into the broader net zero strategies? So there's 4 different ways here that I've highlighted. Firstly, there's alignment with holistic certification schemes. So a good example of this is GBCA's Green Star certification uses NABERS Waste data and ratings to actually form a part of that certification. There's also high demand for third-party verified reporting. As I highlighted a couple of slides ago, those companies in their annual reports are showing their targets and their achievements. Very often they're referring back to a NABERS rating, and the material recovery score itself aligns with the GRI standard. So we're trying to streamline it as much as possible. Third, around net zero targets and looking beyond energy systems. So as the grid decarbonizes and buildings electrify, we're seeing a much greater focus on the emissions associated with other areas, for example, embodied carbon and operational waste. And that'll end up making up a greater percentage of total emissions in the future. So at the moment, it's a much lower percentage, but as it decarbonizes, then that's much higher. And lastly, great understanding of systematic nature of the challenges. So NABERS is in a unique position, bringing in data from building owners, being plugged into both government, non-government industries as a whole. And we've seen some very interesting trends through things like our annual reporting that Ron highlighted, and our yearly sustainable portfolio index. And this data has been used to help shape resources that we freely hand out to policy setters. An example you can see on the right there is the NABERS Policy Toolkit. So it's really about equipping policymakers with the right data to make informed decisions as to what goes into the policy. I think I'm running a little bit over time, so I'll just be brief and touch upon the future. Now, if you jump in, there's basically five areas. Firstly, it's the transition to the circular supply chain. So at present, we're really mostly stuck in a very linear model, and most products that are put out today stay in that top 8 R categories, refuse, rethink, reduce, repair, etc. And really, for us to transition to a full circular model, we need to start thinking beyond those initial 8 and move into the areas further down. And that transition needs to happen fast. There's a quote there from the 2023 Circularity Gap report, and it estimates that the globe is really only 7.2% circular. So really, there's a long way to go here. This isn't, tweaking on the edges. There's big changes that need to occur. The next slide, we've got ramping up of regulation, and that's taking the form of both a carrot and a stick approach. So I mentioned previously the federal, state, territory governments setting up targets, and that underpins policy in this space. And we're really at the start of seeing this being implemented at various levels. So couple of examples, you've got the Recycling and Waste Reduction Act 2020 that's been enacted recently in ACT. Another good one is the Waste Avoidance and Resource Recovery Regulation 2017. And that actually is the one that enables the container deposit scheme in New South Wales. Third, we've got alignment to embodied carbon. So another area that's quite significant. There's an increased focus on reporting of upfront carbon in the NCC and more government incentives to support circular economy outcomes. So to meet this, last week, NABERS actually launched the embodied carbon tool, which covers pretty much most of the stage of a building's life cycle. And an area of future work is looking at the crossovers between the embodied carbon of a building and the operational waste. Yep, fourth, I mentioned earlier about global influences and that innovation in this space in Australia has been lacking of late. So what we really need to see is that conditions to support future innovation. And while government has a role to play in supporting R&D, we really need all actors. We're talking, not just government, non-profit, the for-profit sectors, and even the public to come together and really create these conditions to foster innovation. And finally, we're already starting to see corporations start to develop or implement nature-positive strategies and biodiversity goals. And waste and circular economy is really key to this. So, look, that's a really brief overview, kind of zoom through to get to the panel session. If I had to give a big takeaway here, it's that, while the move to a circular model hasn't been ideal or hasn't really been that quick to date, it's really an area that's undergoing rapid transition and transformation as the focus starts to move beyond just looking at the energy side of building sustainability. And yeah, that's it. So I'll hand over back to you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Andy. Really appreciate it. We're going to get started with our panel now. So just give me a moment to allow all of our panelists to turn their videos on and unmute themselves. Hello, Josh. Hello, David. And hello, Alex. Excellent. So I'm just going to get us started with a quick introduction. I'll get those slides back on for you so you know who you're talking to. So we'll be hearing from 3 people today. As Andy mentioned earlier, we actually did essentially slightly different version of this panel at the Australian Waste and Recycling Expo this year. And we had really good response, really good conversation. We also had a bit of fun. And so we decided to do it again for a different audience, for a larger audience, and also to record it so that we'd be able to share it after today. So everybody needs to be on their best behavior, please. We will be joined today on this panel by Josh Begbie, who is the CEO of GECA, David Baggs, CEO of Global GreenTag, and Alex Northey, who I mentioned earlier, is the founder of WasteCheck and one of our most prolific waste assessors. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to now stop sharing this slide and I'm going to pass first to Josh to do a quick intro. I often find it a little bit odd sometimes when you're listening to a panel discuss these very important and interesting topics, but you don't actually know who you're hearing from or understand the context of the work that they do and the space that they operate in. So we'll give everybody a minute or two to introduce themselves. I will start with you, please, Josh.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So Josh Begbie, I'm the CEO of GECA, also previously known as Good Environmental Choice Australia, for those of you who've been around a while. And GECA is a lifecycle eco-label certification program. So we try to look at everything about a product from where the materials are extracted from all the way through its transformation to what happens at end of life. And we look at products and a few services, including a couple in the waste area, looking at, impact on human health. Are they fit for purpose? How do they go in terms of social criteria? Are workers being looked after throughout the supply chain? All those kinds of questions, as well as, of course, the minimizing the impact on the environment. And yeah, so we have schemes that basically set minimums against all of those different areas, and people have to meet all of those minimums. And if they do, then they get a GECA certification. Although I've only been there 18 months, GECA's been around nearly 25 years, which is an amazing thing. And we love working in this space because we're always looking to find that balance between setting certification goals that are both achievable while also being aspirational. So we're driving change, but also recognizing those who meet that challenge and meet those certifications. So yeah, we love doing that. And I love talking about waste personally. I know it's not everyone's favorite topic, but it's a great one that I really enjoy. So thanks, Alex.
Thank you so much, Josh. Yes, we have had a lot of conversations. You're definitely one of the honorary waste nerds at the NABERS team. Speaking of waste nerds. David, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, CEO, technical director, and co-founder of Global GreenTag. We've been around for nearly 15 years now, and before that, we operated the Eco Specifier platform. Professionally, I'm an architect, green building designer. Worked in the field as a sustainability consultant for over 40 years now, and GreenTag operates certification, transparency reporting, and an environmental product declaration program. And what we do is effectively rate the performance of products against a scale. So we create a minimum benchmark of what is unacceptable, and then create a tiered set of labels beyond that. And then in some areas we also go in from, so we have a transparency report that relates to health, one that relates to modern slavery, another one that relates to whole of life cycle analysis. So all of those sort of programs come under the banner of Global GreenTag, and our engagement in waste and circular economy is deep and consistent across a number of those labels. Where particularly, say, with our Nature Positive program, we actually have specific circular economy metrics that we tease out as part of the process.
Thank you very much, David. And Alex, if you would be so kind as to introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, NABERS, for having me here today. It's greatly appreciated. So if you haven't had the opportunity to see this documentary yet, and so long as obviously you've got Netflix, if you watch the Netflix documentary by now, obviously after this session, you'll understand what I do. So for 20 years, I was part of the problem working in the fast-moving consumer goods sector in some fairly interesting levels, and even had my own supermarket for several years. So to pay my penance, my FMCG penance, I set out to be part of the solution and entered the waste sector in 2016. Started working for some of the waste companies, saw how poorly they treated their audiences, and said things can be done better. So I came out as a waste consultant back in 2017. And in that time, we rate about 10% of all the buildings that are NABERS Waste rated across Australia. And we've helped a few of them that are quite passionate about waste and recycling achieve 80% recycling rates. We also work in the GRES space, so a Green Star and building developments. But more importantly, one thing that we have seen is around data quality, and a real problem in this space. Obviously, there's manual solutions that are available at the moment. So we took this problem to the ANU Engineering Capstone program in 2020, and they helped deliver an automated solution, which is now being manufactured and piloted here in the ACT for the next few months. So Questacon have had it for all of last year. And if you want to get some more information after this session, please look up Questacon Smart Bin and you'll get some understanding and context. So it's potentially it's designed to move waste in the same spaces where energy and water data currently is. That's it. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you so much. All right, well, let's just dive straight in. First of all, for a little bit of context, we are talking about circular economy in the built environment today. So narrowing it down to that space. And obviously we are NABERS Waste, so we definitely have that focus on operational waste. So my first question is a really simple, quick one. And the question is, what does circular economy in the built environment mean to you? What does it look like in your contexts? If we could please start with you, David.
Well, one of the things that alarms me most that I hadn't seen in our previous get together was that stat that I think was that Andy showed nearly a 10% increase in waste volumes only after only a few years, and our ability to recycle only just managing barely to keep up with that. So we're almost after years, we're in almost a net no net difference position. So I think our first call to action is say avoid, create alternative pathways to things that need to be, that generate waste. That has to be the first point. The other then is to really start at the beginning of the supply chain, which is actually halfway through the supply chain, because we're talking about a circular economy. And the reality is we have to create markets for the products that we're creating. So as a designer, as a builder, we need to, as an industry, be looking at buying products and focusing on the purchase of products which are already using recycled material from the circular economy. So that would be number one. And of course, ultimately then, if you're going to incorporate them in a building, they need to be incorporated in a way that they can either be reused, as a whole building, or as an element, or designed for disassembly back to an individual element or individual material. So that's, ultimately the strategy. And then, building owners and asset owners need to be, issuing instructions that buildings are not to be demolished in 2 minutes by pushing them over into a heap of splinters, as happens now mostly, but to start deconstructing actual buildings and recovering materials. That's kind of pretty much the overall arching from my point of view.
Thank you so much. And Alex, what does circular economy in the built environment look like for you?
Good question. So obviously, as an assessor, I'm seeing waste materials that are coming down to the bins. And one thing that I have seen, I guess, a significant improvement on is more packaged materials are now circular. So to give you an example, when people are doing their ICT equipment purchases, a lot of the computer equipment is no longer being delivered with expandable polystyrene and polyurethane. It's now being wholly cardboard, which is fantastic. And that material is obviously circular. It can be recycled up to 8 times, as most people probably know on this call. And so that's one of the fantastic shifts I'm seeing. And even something as simple as printer paper packaging. That's normally a bonded material. It's normally shiny, but particularly the last 12 months, I'm seeing that material is now, they're getting rid of the bonded material, and now the packaging is now recyclable instead of the contents. So I guess that's what I'm seeing.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Last but not least, Josh.
Oh, I think I just want to commend both David and Alex for what they've said, because you have actually covered the two elements for me, which is in the built environment, we've got to look at, the macro level, which is how do we make the buildings? How do we use the buildings? How do we make sure that they stay along for a long time? And then when we're using the buildings, what are we doing with them, with the actions that we are taking as individuals? And we have to operate at both levels. And at that big level, there's things around fit outs and construction and demolition and longer term questions. And then in the operational sense, there's, things related to waste that Alex was talking about, but even the decisions that we make as we use these assets that we have. And we have to do both. And I think driving the conversation at both levels requires different conversations, but the same shift in mindset, which is what, David and Alex have both talked about. How do we, and even as certification schemes, how do we encourage people to stop thinking about a life cycle of a thing being that linear process that we've always talked about? Something is made, it's used, and then you get rid of it, and hopefully you recycle it and turn it into something else, into the whole idea of how are we setting up materials to be reused over and over and over again? And wherever you sit in that space, what is my role to encourage behavior change that supports that circular approach? So I think it is getting that mindset shift into all of us and reminding ourselves each day that we have a role to play in this.
And if I can just jump in there, Alex, please. I mean, one of the things that concerns me, and I'm linking back to this, 10% odd growth in volumes over the last few years, is the fact that a lot of that is polymers. And if we have an increasing share of polymers in the recyclates and in the products that are coming back out for reuse, and in fabrics and textiles and carpets and building materials, then We are actually increasing the microplastic generation as a result of degradation over the life of that product. And that is turning into an increasingly problematical issue as we find out more and more about it. And it's something that we really can't lose sight of as part of this whole picture.
Yes, thank you. So when we were putting together, the first time we did this panel, when we were putting together some of the things that we wanted to talk about, essentially what we drew upon was, what are some of the biggest challenges that we see in a transition to a circular economy in Australia, and what are some of the hottest topics at the moment. So we'll start with data challenges, which is one of my favorite things to whinge about and get very excited about and talk to you all about. So ideally, we want to be seeing things like full life cycle analysis or detailed supply chain flows, but not having access to the right data or data integrity issues, or as we know, sometimes a complete lack of data can really hinder that sort of work. So can you please elaborate on some of the data challenges and measurement gaps that you experience in the course of your work? Could I please start with you, Josh?
Sure, absolutely. So maybe let me just mostly draw experiences from the operational waste certification scheme that we run. Data is data in this space is notoriously difficult to get right. But one of the challenges that we find is the speed at which data comes. And if data comes too slowly, and Alex, I'd love to hear more about that Smart Bin program that's been set up at Questacon, because that, sounds like an instantaneous solution, which would be brilliant.
Yeah.
But failing having an instantaneous solution, one of the things is if you just get a data report, at the end of the year or something along those lines that looks back to what was happening 15 months ago, it's very difficult to assess whether any changes you have made to how you operate things have had a direct impact on that waste, because the time lag is so long. You need data more frequently. And you also need to have clarity around data moving between different parts, because operational waste, waste from buildings in particular goes through a lot of different hands before it ends up either as hopefully a new material, or if not in landfill or, waste energy plant or something. And we need to have good communication up and down that list of exchanges, because otherwise the data gets lost, it gets misinterpreted, it gets misunderstood, and there's a lack of clarity, and that not only means that people can't rely on the data, and it makes it very difficult to report and to know where you stand, but again, it feeds back to that challenge of, well, what do I change? Because if I don't know the outcome of what I'm doing now, how do I know if I'm going to change something or what I should change to get a better result if I can't trust that? So I think where we have focused historically is trying to encourage closer communication and more rapid data flows between all the different parts of the supply chain with an agreed set of reporting frameworks set up in a really close partnership, so that people know what they know and they know it quickly, and they can use that to modify behavior.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alexandra. Look, in essence, at the moment, data collection is manual. So that's whether the waste companies are coming to collect that data and they're collecting those data points, or if you've got a manual weighing system in your buildings, it's all manual. And often, as an assessor, it's hard trying to establish the integrity of that data and trying to put your hand on your heart and say, well, look, this is the existing recycling rate for a building. So I guess there's a real opportunity, and we identified this several years ago, to move this into an automated solution like energy and water. And that's obviously going to improve the data governance, integrity, and more importantly, the chain of custody outcome for waste materials. So as Josh was just saying, being able to identify that the material has left the building, it's been collected and it's been transported to the right place, and then it's being made into new products from the waste materials. That's ultimately the end goal. And at the moment, all of those steps are manual. That's it, Alexander.
Thank you. And David.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of layers to this from my point of view. One is the fact that it's great that NABERS now has greenhouse factors, and they're great to use in a generic sense to give general guidelines and sort of to target sort of mode of construction and design formats and those sorts of things. But ultimately, when it comes down to a final building design, you need detailed information to be able to aggregate. And to do that, you need to be able to have fully detailed life cycle information. So all of the products that are used in a building need to have environmental product declarations. That relies on life cycle analysis. Life cycle analysis is, its full name is life cycle impact analysis. And an impact is typically a negative, and traditional LCA only looks at negatives. So once we start talking about circular economy, the whole purpose of that is to generate benefit, to avoid impact on resources, to avoid impact, avoid more pollution, avoid, more deforestation and loss of biodiversity. And LCA doesn't pick that up. It doesn't have indicators for that. So we have this whole, until recently, we've had this lack of metrics around benefits. So there is now a life cycle benefit analysis methodology. The Ever Institute puts it out, and that's one of the things that we're starting to use in the circular economy and nature positive work we're doing. So, but what we need is the whole industry to be using that benefit analysis on a more broad sense, because without that, the uplift that we get from taking a waste material and turning it into a product, or taking a piece of furniture and refurbishing it, or even as something as simple as just taking a piece of furniture and reusing it with a clean down, we have no way of quantifying the benefits of that. And therefore you have no offsets against the costs and the impacts of the processes. So it's often when you do a life cycle analysis of a recycled or product, it often looks worse than a product that is made from virgin materials, because there's no offset to the additional impacts. We're not measuring the benefits. That benefit methodology needs to be adopted by a wider sector of the industry, so that we start measuring that missing gap. Because if you think about the way LCA is structured, you've got cradle to end of life fate plus options. So some options might say, well, it can be a certain percentage of that material is going to be recycled. Okay, so it gets a little bit of information, and then when the next product cycles, it picks up some of that information and looks at the next life cycle. But there's a whole piece in the middle, which is the benefit uplift, that is missing and that needs to be put into the equation, so that the whole implication from multiple life cycles is captured, and the extra costs and impacts can be offset against the benefits.
Thank you so much. So, product stewardship. Often, when we focus in on operational waste, there can be a perspective that there's this idea that a building is just essentially a space that resources pass through, and that product stewardship is a role really only for those who produce or sell a product. I know that a lot of people on this webinar today would disagree with that, but still it is something that we consistently come up against, that perspective. So sort of spinning it to the positive a bit, what opportunities are there to practice product stewardship in the built environment? If we could start with you, Josh, please.
Sure. I think I would just say, when having conversations with people who take that view, look, I'm all for extended product responsibility programs where, manufacturers really look at and design for, how do I recover this material after it's used so that it can go back into a process. I think that's an excellent thing to do. But that is not where we are today. And where we are today is that until that happens, these materials are passing through our buildings, and the people who are also passing through those buildings, your tenants, even the investors who invest in your holding companies, or shareholders or things like that, they care today that we are making the best use of the resources that are in our buildings today. And I think for the tenants, for many of them, this is one of the very few places where they can play an active role in getting a better outcome from their tenancy, other than buying recycling, buying renewable energy contracts and things like that. This is one of the very few places where they have agency to do something, and they want to do something. So don't tell them that they don't have a role to play. They do, and they want to exercise it. So I would just say, set up your systems in the built environment to enable the agency of everyone who's using those things to be working towards the good. Because one, you'll get better outcomes, and two, if you don't, they will go somewhere else.
It's quite an incentive. Alex.
Taking myself off mute. Thank you. Look, in particular product stewardship, what I'm seeing in my travels is predominantly facility managers and developers themselves being more conscious of the end of life of materials and infrastructure within buildings. And what they're now better understanding is if they separate that material correctly at the point of disposal, it can actually improve their recycling outcomes, but more importantly, it helps to save their costs. And some of those costs can be significant, particularly in places like Sydney, where waste disposal costs are significantly higher than other parts of Australia.
Thanks, David.
Look, obviously we're seeing product stewardship schemes, pop up in terms of the high priority issues, like ICT, tires, mattresses, emerging ones for flooring, resilient flooring, and furniture as well, starting to sort of move through a development process. But if you look at the bulk of the industry that isn't covered by product stewardship schemes, the only way we can really take it further is probably to rely more on extended producer responsibility, where individual manufacturers take charge of their return products or reused products themselves. And examples of that include people like Herman Miller, where their recycled chairs is their strongest part of their business. They repurpose, they bring them back, refurbish them, and resell them. To do that, you've got to have durable products to begin with. You've got to have products that have been designed for long life. And that's kind of the nexus of where we are. We actually have to get over this nexus of this short, purposely, designed for short end of life, and without repairability, without spares being available, sort of have the whole product cycle shortening and shortening and shortening. We need to be able to reverse that trend, and I suspect the way the EU is, we have to get that to reverse. We need to have legislative input, and there needs to, particularly in the building sector, I've learned after 40 years of trying to make changes at a policy level within the building sector, that the only way the whole industry changes is if there are legislative requirements. It's the only way it happens. So, because no one wants to be the first one in, because the whole tail end of the industry, will ride the coattails of the leaders. So ultimately, we do need some legislative input in the sector, and what that looks like, obviously, is open for discussion. But I think it's got to be a multi-tiered approach.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, nowhere in the world is the expression "rubbish in, rubbish out" more true than in waste management, circular economy, in the built environment, right? It's where it comes from. I'm actually going to, I said everyone had to be well behaved, but I'm going to break that, and I'm actually going to jump to the last question because it just segues so perfectly from what you were talking about, David. And then we'll come back to the second last question in a moment. So you're talking about regulation. This is the drum that I have heard you beat many times now, and I could not agree with you more. So let's go to that innovation versus regulation question. So considering the challenges that we've talked about so far and the opportunities that we've discussed. You know, we're talking about more and better data, looking at product stewardship through a different lens. And in a moment, we'll talk about meaningful partnerships. But in terms of innovation and regulation, what are the biggest levers we can pull at a systems level to create the conditions for a circular economy to grow and thrive? And why don't I just go back to you, David, so you can essentially complete your thinking.
Well, ultimately, you know, it's, to my way of thinking, it's a carrot and a stick thing. Innovation drives the leading edge. It creates market uplift. It encourages new technologies and new ideas, and basically enables a whole lot of stuff that we couldn't do before. The leading edge will always have a set of followers, a set of partners, some people who want to be there. But, you know, as I said before, the only way to bring the tail end of the market up is to have minimum requirements at a legislative level. And, you know, it's that simple. You know, that's what 40 years of experience in trying to change the building industry has shown me. You cannot do without legislation. There has to be a minimum performance requirement. And that needs to be enacted across the entire industry.
Thanks. Josh.
Yeah, look, I fully agree with David, and I think very often at the conferences that we all go to and the conversations we have, we're often talking with the early adopters who are keen to progress, who are keen to do what they can next, and it's a struggle to say, well, how do we get to the rest of the curve, and how do we get them up there without legislation? And I don't have the answer, but the one tool that we do have is procurement. And I would just encourage anyone who has a procurement function to say, when you are ambitious or reasonably ambitious within the limits of what's possible for your company, but where you are ambitious in your procurement, you drive demand. You are the business case for why people do better. So if you want to see more people come to the table with good, sustainable options without waiting for regulation, because let's be honest, in Australia, we are not quick at getting good environmental legislation and advanced environmental legislation. So if you're impatient like me, put it in your procurement, and then you will see people respond to it because there's a business case. So please be ambitious.
And if I can just extend that to architects, designers, builders, and specifiers.
Anyone with their finger in the pie, essentially, right?
Yes. Let's be ambitious together. 100%, David.
And Alex.
Well said, David and Josh. That's very well said. Look, we're particularly vocal in this space with NABERS, and I'm sure Alexandra will attest to this. This is a great opportunity for government in particular to lead by example and show the rest of the industry how to, I guess, adopt new innovation technologies, because at the end of the day, it's going to help you, I guess, meet your sustainable development goals and waste data governance integrity requirements and net zero requirements. More importantly, this is a golden opportunity for government to lead by example by adopting as much new innovation as possible in the waste space.
Yeah, and
Alex. Oh, sorry. Can I just jump in there and give a wholehearted support to that? So GECA is part of the Global Ecolabel Network, which is a group of ecolabels around the world. And one of the things that we often talk about is the power of government procurement to not just change the outcome in government, but to change the outcome for the jurisdictions that they are administering, because they are such a significant customer that when that requirement is in place, it creates enough supply to try and feed it, that then the commercial sector around it can say, well, hey, if government can do it, we can do it, because there's enough supply there. And then that it increases the size of the pie of people doing the right thing. And once that happens, then there starts to be applications that go out even to, local government levels, to residential areas, to planned communities, all those kinds of things start to say, well, if they can do it, we can do it. And so it is a hugely, hugely powerful tool. And so I just 100% support that, even if the government is skittish about setting regulations for minimum expectations, where they lead by example, they set the tone that has a really positive, beneficial effect in all the community around. So sorry, I'll get off my hobby horse now.
Yeah,
but well done.
If I can too, just say, yes, Joe, I agree 100%. I would also, though, extend that to every single architect, designer, and procurer when they talk to manufacturers to ask for what they want. Communicate to the
Yes.
manufacturers what they want to see.
Yes.
Because every single person in those roles in the industry and in government have agency in that regard.
They do. And when they have those conversations, refer to a common standard so that everybody's not asking for a different thing. But, we've got NABERS here, right? We've got Green Star standards. We've got certification schemes like GreenTag and GECA. Use those tools so that everybody is asking for the same benchmark, because that's what allows service providers and manufacturers to deliver a consistent outcome to everyone and not say, well, I have to do this for that one and this for that one and this for that one. How can I possibly have all that variation? So yes, I think we all vociferously agree with each other on this.
I mean,
Very
there's a
much.
reason you're all on a panel together, right? So I will just flag that this is the last question I'm going to ask. So for any of our attendees who have any questions for the Q&A, now would be a great time to punch those into the Q&A box. So the last question is actually just for Josh. And it's about partnerships. So thank you all for setting up that segue for me beautifully again. We're essentially talking about people within this ecosystem actually getting out of their chairs, leaving their buildings and talking to one another to create the market conditions for the shifts that we want to see, right? And we all have a role. We all have a role to play there. Sometimes when we talk about market conditions, it conversations end up looking a bit like, the Spider-Man meme. 3 Spider-Men standing in an alleyway, all pointing at one another. But everyone in the built environment has a role to play in creating market conditions for the shifts that we want to see. So final question is about partnerships for Josh. So we often talk about, connecting all actors in the chain, from design and construction to fit out through to operations. So cleaners, facilities managers, waste collection, MRFs. So to close us off, I think it's a perfect question because it's sort of essentially a call to action, really. To close us off, the question is, why are these partnerships and these conversations important, and where do you see this working already?
Thank you. Such an important question. One of the things that, all of my conversations about waste make very, very clear is that it's very easy for anyone, or nearly anyone in the chain, to say, I don't want to do it. It's not possible. It can't be done. And then the whole conversation can quickly shut down because someone says, well, if they can't do it, I can't do it, right? And then ambition falls apart right there. So I think the first thing to say about partnership is, for us to get better outcomes, particularly in the waste space, we all need to be willing to see what's possible, to progress what's possible, and then to continue to iterate that further into further improvements. The second thing is to do that, as you've just said, it can't be everyone playing the blame game. Well, I would do it if they would just do this, and they would do it, but this person doesn't do that, so how can I affect that? And so to do that, you have to have ownership of what that partnership looks like. And that means that someone somewhere in the supply chain has to own those conversations. At GECA, one of the things that we have tried to do is set up a system whereby the people who actually collect the waste, who sit in the middle between waste that's being generated through the built environment and then being taken to MRFs and remake facilities and things like that, because they have visibility both directions, they can own that partnership and ensure that they have good conversations with those upstream generating waste and those downstream dealing with the waste. And they're given a responsibility and a requirement to do that well. And so if you give power to someone in that chain to do it, and you make sure that everyone knows that they have to be a part of it, I think those are the two conditions that must be in place for this partnership to work. Because if you don't have that partnership, as you just said, it's just so easy for the whole thing to fall apart because someone says, well, I've done my part, but if that isn't happening, there's nothing more I can do, so I won't try and I won't be ambitious. And the world cannot afford to be unambitious. Not with the stats that, Andy put up at the beginning that David has referred to. Our waste is growing, our recycling capability is barely keeping pace, our circularity outcomes are 7%. Now, we've got to do better, and we need that partnership, and we need everyone to be on board and for someone to own it.
I think that will be our tagline when we recap this webinar. It is the world cannot afford to be unambitious in this space. That's a good one. Thank you, Josh. So let's go to the Q&A. We've got one question in here. I'm going to frame it slightly differently only because Meredith asked a fantastic question which has quite a lot of overlap with this question that Chad has asked. So, and Meredith's question has been answered in the chat. So for the leftover portion of Chad's question that hasn't been answered, the question is essentially, you know, a reuse system allows operational waste avoidance, in brackets, source reduction, and a circular approach. Agreed. So how do you think reuse can be better recognized in ESG reporting? As we all know, this is one of the challenges, right? Is that, you know, different tools, different dashboards, different reports, it's quite challenging sometimes to capture avoidance, to measure what's not happening. So the question is, how do we think we can essentially get better at that in ESG reporting? Anyone feel free to jump in.
Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind. I know that there is some focus on this beginning to be put in place in the FF&E sector. There's also the benefit measurement methodology that we spoke about before, but that can get quite, complex and detailed. So, the short answer at the moment is there isn't anything that allows us to do that I'm aware of anyway, but that we are, and the industry is aware of the issue, and that certain sectors anyway are moving to try and overcome that at a level that can be managed relatively easily, as opposed to something that has to go to sort of a deep life cycle analysis level to be able to achieve.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just jump in and say it's not perfect. There are a lot, very often I think innovation takes a while to catch up to, reporting takes a while to catch up to innovation. But let us not let that be the barrier to innovation and doing those things. I think there's a few different things that can help. One is if people want to report on an outcome and they're worried that by taking a novel approach to reporting on an outcome, they may be construed as greenwashing, or they may be construed as, overstating the case or something like that. Groups like, well, all of us here on the panel can help to verify those kinds of things so that you can stand and say, hand on heart, this is innovative. Here's how we've reported it, right? Here's how we talk about it. And here's somebody else who's come in to say, yeah, that's a legit claim. And that has legit outcomes that are good for people and planet. And we can help do that to take the risk from that. I think the second thing I would say is the world will catch up, and the world will recognize the innovators in this space. And particularly investors and groups like that are savvy enough to know that where new things are happening, even if the reporting isn't exactly right, that innovation is going to be useful down the track. And the third thing I would just say is, try to reduce costs where you can, or avoided outcomes. So David has talked a lot about avoided outcomes and the need to try and measure that through a lot of the work that he's doing. But where that can be reflected in cost savings in some way, like Alex was talking about, particularly in Sydney with some improved recycling outcomes and things like that. Where any of those things can tie to cost, that's a very easy story to tell and a great one to tell. And then I think the last thing I would say is, I'm not so familiar with the reuse facilities available within buildings for resources within buildings. I imagine that's something that's an emerging area, and that's a great and important thing to have. But even for things like fit outs, as David alluded to, there are platforms that allow you to say, look, I can't use this anymore. How can I keep this resource in the environment at its highest and best use for the longest possible time when I can't use it anymore? There are platforms that are built to do that. And for often a fairly low cost, you can go through and get those resources in that platform so that they can be reused by someone else or refurbished by someone, or taken by a charity or social enterprise and turned into a different product, a new product, or recycled if none of those things is possible. But those platforms do exist, and if we use them, they can often report back to you at least on avoided carbon outcomes from landfill. Not a perfect metric, but it's a thing. It's something you can talk about that people can readily understand. So all pioneering ways of doing it, but available today and useful for the planet.
Thank you, Josh. You mentioned something there just a second ago, which I thought was very valuable. And there is one metric, particularly in the property sector, that should definitely be given more attention to, and it's around waste avoidance. So a classic example is, particularly in my travels when I'm looking at buildings, I see a lot of the times under desk bins. And by removing the under desk bins and having, say, nesting bins or common area bins, you get a reduction in bin liners, you get a reduction in cleaning costs, and that metric and I guess being able to reduce those costs, that is something that you can measure. And that is something that I guess is a metric that is widely adopted and I guess referenced to, is to say, well, look, it might not necessarily be NABERS, but we've got this metric that says, okay, we've now got a reduction in cost by implementing these very simple solutions.
Thanks so much, Alex. For Alex Northey, where do you think the NABERS Waste tool can be most impactful in the coming years? No pressure, Alex. Just lay out our strategy for us, please. I'll start taking notes.
Well, actually, I have mentioned this recently to NABERS, and it's more so because there's lots of mixed messages across Australia about what is and what isn't recyclable. And one thing that I've mentioned to NABERS is potentially for NABERS to be the single source of truth as to what can and can't be recycled in Australia. And I think that would probably be a great starting point. And I think, that's where I'd really like to see NABERS potentially step up into that space and being that reference point. And then obviously data integrity is definitely one that is very close and passionate. Obviously, I've got my own axe to grind here in this space, but this is one where I'm seeing there's a lot of opportunity in the space for improvement. So hopefully that helps answer the question, Alexandra.
I believe so. I didn't ask it, but I think you've answered the question. Yeah, and I would probably add to that as well that where we see it being quite powerful as well as several of you have mentioned it already, is as a powerful procurement tool. And that's something I'd like to be really clear with our audience today, that it's in our draft plan. Hasn't been released yet, but it's in our draft plan for the next 5 years, and it is something that we are absolutely actively looking at. And so sometimes, when you're not the one working behind the scenes and you're the one on the front end of a tool, there's a bit of, we talked about delay, right? There's a little bit of a delay in understanding that actually we have heard something and we are working on it. So I'd like to make that really clear today. And also to go back to that great question from Chad as well. From Meredith as well. Just to highlight what Andy put in the Q&A, which is that we are actively looking at the way that the ratings use waste intensity to better meet the challenges as the industry moves to circular models. So again, I want to just explicitly say We hear it, we get it. Frankly, we wouldn't be very good at our jobs if we didn't even just understand the theoretical foundations of this question. So we hear it, we get it, and we are working on it. So I just wanted to leave you with that as well in terms of all the questions that have been asked today. So that is us done for that panel. Thank you so much, Alex, Josh, and David. I really appreciate it. Having said that, thank you so much to everybody who's joined us today. It's a really busy time of year for everyone, so we are deeply appreciative and genuinely grateful that everybody has made the time to be here today and to stick around. It's about 15 minutes longer than we usually do a webinar. We didn't lose very many people on the hour as we ticked over 2 o'clock, so that's a really great thing to see. Really appreciate the time that everybody's taken. I would also like to again take a moment to say thank you to Ron, thank you to Andy, thank you to Carissa Quintana, who has, as I said, been our tech elf in the background, making sure that everything's been running smoothly. And although Magali wasn't able to present today due to some tech issues, thank you for the time that you put into preparation. I really appreciate it. Final closing remarks. Please do reach out to us if you, and by us I mean the NABERS Waste team, if you want to be involved in the strategic direction of NABERS Waste. Andy and Ron both spoke about the fact that there's a NABERS 5-year plan in development. That has not been developed in a vacuum. We have been doing nothing but talking to people outside of our building. But if you haven't been involved in that and you'd like to be involved in it, please do get in touch. Or, you know, if you're a potential customer on this call, reach out to an assessor like Alex. Doesn't have to be Alex, but like Alex.
Thank you.
And last but not least, this has been recorded today and we will put it on YouTube so that you can watch it back if you missed anything, or share it with colleagues that wanted to join but couldn't, or share it with anyone else in your network. Thank you again, and have a wonderful break, everybody. You're probably all headed off on break in a few weeks' time, so have a wonderful, well-deserved break. Thank you all.
Thanks, Alexander.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers.